So once again, as we huddle in our houses, the vineyards are not paying any attention to us and starting their 220-day cycle towards ripeness and towards the harvest. It's relatively early bud break for us. We had some very warm weather this year, so we've been lucky to have that. And we've had several days where the weather has been very cold, and we've been a little afraid of frost, but things are good now. We're starting a period of warming, so we'll be able to get some sleep at night and not have to worry about the frost in the vineyards of the lower valley floor. And I think we're looking towards another interesting harvest. We just had some rain, which is very good for the vineyards. They need that early spring rain. And it's been a year where we haven't had much rain, which is pretty common in California. But getting this late rain and getting quite a lot of it in the last couple of days has been very good. So we're taking off, and the vines are taking off, and we should have good growth this year. So it's everything's coming together in the vineyard, that is. For you, maybe not so much. It's been a very hard 2020, and I think of you all at home. Hopefully you're doing what I'm doing, which is drinking up my cellar. My wife, Claire, and I seem to be getting through about a bottle of wine a night at minimum. Or like three, according to my daughter. No, that's not true. But we are drinking quite a lot out of our cellars and enjoying ourselves and trying to make the best of a tough situation. I've been enjoying the 8 o'clock howling we have for people working in the healthcare industry, and I send my great thanks out to all of those people, not only in the healthcare industry, but all of those people that are working this time of year for the good of all of us. People that are working in supermarkets, people that are working in cafes, people that are doing takeout food at restaurants. I send my love out to all those people. And I have to also send a little word of worry to all of our friends in the restaurant industry. People that work in restaurants, waiters, sommeliers, front of house people. I sympathize with you. This is a very difficult time, and I want to say how much we support you, and we are doing everything we can to support restaurants as best we can in this time. And hopefully we can get through this. As the Queen says, we will see each other soon, and I am looking forward to that. So we're going to taste 4 wines today, and they're 4 old girlfriends of mine from my early days with Blackbird. As some of you may know, I've been working with Blackbird for now 14 years. This is my 14th year working for Blackbird. I started in 2007, the very year that I started Pott Wine, and also started We Clo Consulting, which is my consulting company, consulting for wineries only in the Napa Valley. And they were one of my first clients. In that year, I signed Blackbird, Fisher Vineyards, Quintessa, and Seven Stones. And I'm still working with Seven Stones and Blackbird Vineyards after all these years, which is wonderful. And very happy to do that. Blackbird's real special, a very special winery for me. I mean, mainly because of its devotion, its great devotion to right bank varieties. And as some of you know, the original Blackbird Vineyard which really was planted in 1997 and had some early success right off the first vintage in 1999 with a wine that was made by Mia Klein under her Celine label. And was labeled Blackbird Vineyards, was a fabulous wine, and still is a fabulous wine if you can get a hold of it. The 1999 Celine from Mia Klein Blackbird Vineyard Merlot. And that's really where Blackbird started. It started because of an interest in right bank Bordeaux varieties. And when we speak of right bank, what we mean is the right bank of the Gironde River in France. That little cut at the bottom left-hand side of France, when you look at the map, is where Bordeaux is, and there was a very important estuary there, which was essentially where you came into France when you sailed into France, into this estuary. And the right bank, if you're looking down river, it's on your right-hand side, and that would be Saint-Emilion and Paramour, so to the northeast of the city of Bordeaux. And those varieties are dominated, the varieties there are dominated by Cabernet Franc and Merlot, especially Merlot. Grapes were planted there in 56 BC, and it's hard to tell when Merlot and Cabernet Franc came in, but Cabernet Franc was probably a very early contender there, since it goes back such an early time. It's a much older variety and is the father of most of the Bordeaux varieties that we know of today. I mean, really, when we think of grapes from the Bordeaux area, we're thinking of the 5 principal ones. That's Malbec, Petit Verdot, Cabernet Franc, Merlot, and Cabernet Sauvignon. Cabernet Franc is both the father of Merlot and of Cabernet Sauvignon, because it's part of the crosses of both of those varieties. So Blackbird really founded on this idea that Merlot and Cabernet Franc were making stunning wines around the world, that they make great wines in the Napa Valley when they're planted in the right place. And really, for Cabernet Franc, that means well-drained soils that are rocky, principally. Cabernet Franc also likes hillsides more than it likes the flats. And Merlot likes humidity, and it's hard to find sites that have good humidity in the Napa Valley to plant Merlot, so that we're always looking for sites that have good humidity. So I'm going to start with the first wine going way back, and this is Paramour, and this is a 2008 Paramour, and Paramour is what is our Cabernet Franc vehicle. It's mostly Cabernet Franc in many years. It's a wine that was the second wine we produced for Blackbird. The original wine, which was mostly Merlot, we only produced one wine in 2003, 2004, and 2005, and that became the illustration, and that was originally Merlot. And then we introduced Paramour, and Paramour is essentially, your mistress. So if we have Merlot being our true love, then Cabernet Franc is our dear mistress. And I love Merlot. Believe me, I love Merlot. It's one of my favorite grapes to work with, but I love Cabernet Franc more. And I love Cabernet Franc in Napa Valley. It is one of those amazing varieties in Napa Valley, and it produces wonderful wines. Again, I have to say, it needs just the right place to do this. So let's look at this Paramour. Oh, it's really singing right now. I mean, beautiful, a classic Cabernet Franc nose. I mean, what you get instantly is that blueberry character. You get some wonderful tobacco character, cedar. I mean, it smells like a cigar box. Just a wonderful aroma. What I also love is the floral characteristic. And we're getting floral from both Merlot and Cabernet Franc here. So you're getting that real iris aroma that you get from Merlot. And if you haven't smelled an iris, and you can't go to the florist and get them, just find an iris that's out there and smell that iris. It's the most wonderful aroma, and it's a flower that we don't smell enough of. So take time to smell the irises. They're out now, so you will be able to see them. At least they're out here in California. They're out now. They may have gone in other parts of the world. But you also have the Cabernet Franc floral component, which is this intense violet character that just blows up in this nose. Oh, this is really nice. My wife calls me a wine necrophiliac because I love older wines, and it's always a pleasure to taste older wines. It brings a lot of memories back for me of things that happened in 2008. And one of the games that we play as a family when we open up an older bottle of wine is we have to tell a story from that period. So if anybody has good stories from 2008, I would love to hear them. That's delicious. Beautiful aromas. So 2008 for us in Napa Valley was an unusual vintage. And oftentimes people don't talk enough, I think, about vintages in Napa Valley. And there are, despite the fact that we get very little rain between April and October, there are great variations in our vintages. And most of those variations have to do with the intensity of the heat during the vintage. If we can really mitigate that heat and get the heat at the right period of time during the harvest, that really makes a difference for us. A vintage that's successful in California is when we can ripen grapes without getting raisining or dehydration on those grapes. So where they ripen perfectly without getting raisining or dehydration. And it's somewhat the opposite of what you're dealing with in France. Some of you may know I worked in France for quite a while, and running a couple of Grand Cru Classé chateaux there. And the vintages that I worked were all ended by rain. Rain was the decision maker in picking the grapes. So California, we never have that issue, rarely have that issue, I should say, because there's a vintage in here where we'll talk a little bit more about rain. But we rarely have that issue. We pick grapes when they're ripe, ideally before they've raisined or dehydrated. And that really defines our vintage. And some people love that character. I am not a fan of it. I love to pick grapes when they're ripe without raisining, and when they have wonderful characteristics. And so I'll talk a little bit about the vintage. We had very little rainfall in the winter that year, and we had a really nothing, 60% of normal rainfall. And then we had one of the driest springs on record. And really what that does is it sets us up for a very little growth scenario. So the vines come out of dormancy, they bud out, and you have very small canopies that come out from that because they don't have a lot of available water, or you're using your irrigation water early to put onto the grapes, and that's another story. But so 2008 was also interesting that we had incredibly cold spring. So we had over 50 days in early spring of extended frost watch for certain vineyards. Oh, I almost knocked over my glass. For certain vineyards in the Napa Valley, we had extended frost. And as you know, spring frost would kill off of those little buds as they were coming out. They'd kill off those little leaves. And if you were in a vineyard where you were touched by frost, some of those buds would be destroyed. They'd just turn black. And then on each bud, there are 2 secondary buds. And if that primary bud is destroyed, then likely that one or both of those secondary buds will push out and create new growth. But that puts the vineyard way behind. It's also, those tertiary buds are not as powerful as that primary bud, so you're not getting as much growth from out of the carbohydrate reserves of the vine itself. Some growers lost as much as 30% of their crop that way in 2008. So it was a really deadly frost. And I remember it being particularly annoying on those valley floor vineyards because, you know, the frost, the coldest part of the day is in the middle of the night. So you're always waking up to these frost alarms in the middle of the night. And trying to mitigate the frost by in Napa Valley, we use a lot of fans. My house is right next door to Spotswood Vineyard, and they have one of the most ancient fans that you've ever heard. And anybody that ever stays at my house during frost season thinks we're being attacked by helicopters. You know, as soon as those fans go on, it's like apocalypse now around here. So you're awakened at 4 o'clock in the morning by the fan. Or you use sprinklers, and the idea is that the water will freeze around the bud or around the leaves and keep it at that temperature at around 0. And if it goes beyond that, then you could be in trouble. So anyway, big frost year, 2008. April temperatures were exactly the opposite. Suddenly, as soon as the frost season was over in late April, we had temperatures reaching triple digits. So 100-degree temperatures in late April. During the flowering in 2008, within the same week, we had 60-mile-per-hour winds. We had a pretty intense rainstorm. And then we had 100-degree temperatures all in that same week during the time that grapes were flowering, and that really affected all the grapes. But Merlot is a very sensitive flower, so it was a very rough year for Merlot. The season continued to be cool and dry, extending through the end of the season. One of the things that we discovered sort of mid-season was that we had grapes on the same vine that weren't ripening at the same time as other grapes. So it was devastating to not only have very little fruit, because these grapes hadn't flowered properly. So you would have a cluster that would have a few scattered berries on it, what we call shatter. And it would have just a few scattered berries on the cluster. And not only did we have to deal with that lack of production, but we also had to drop a lot of fruit, realizing that there was a lot of unevenness on the vine itself. So the grapes weren't going to ripen at the same time. There were green grapes as the grapes changed color from green to red, or from green to gold in the case of white varieties. But as they went through what we call veraison, we had to drop a lot of fruit. So yields were down tremendously. It was very, very low yields. We had light rains in September and October that kind of aided the vintage along and got the grapes ripe. So the Paramour, it's 49% Cabernet Franc. So that's the dominant grape in there, is that Cabernet Franc. 43% Merlot and 8% Cabernet Sauvignon. So a little bit of Cabernet Sauvignon in there. The Cabernet Franc portion of this wine, it comes from a vineyard called Crocker Star, named for Charlie Crocker, the owner of the property, and then for Pam Star, the legendary Spotswood winemaker. Spotswood, great winery. Spotswood has had a lot of amazing female winemakers, some of the best in the land, and has a history of that. I'm thinking of Rosemary Cakebread, Jen Williams. I mean, there's a lot of them. But then Pam Star was also one of those wonderful Spotswood winemakers. Now the place has been taken over by a man, crazy, Aaron Pott, who's doing a wonderful job making probably the best wines that Spotswood's ever made. So that's the 49% of the Cabernet Franc portion comes from that. It's a vineyard that's in the east side of St. Helena, so just east of town. It's within the town boundaries. But if you were to venture across the street from the high school in St. Helena, if anybody knows where that is, or what was formerly Dean and DeLuca, now Gary's Wine. If you were to go across the street there and down Dowdell Lane, you would reach this property. And the lane is called Dowdell Lane for the original Irish owners of the property. It's been a vineyard since the 1870s, planted to grapes and hops. They made beer on the property. But it's a classic St. Helena bench property. I mean, very, very deep, deep gravel. And you see this when you see creeks in the St. Helena area. The sides of the creeks are often just these sheer walls of gravel. Fantastic gravel soils. And St. Helena has one of the biggest of these benches, of these gravel benches of anywhere in Napa. I think more famously, you have the Rutherford bench and the Oakville bench that are both the same sort of idea, where you have these creeks that are fanning alluvial rocks out across the land when they flood, and they just get deeper and deeper, and you have these rocks piling up over time, and they make great soils for growing grapes. I think a lot of people would recognize wines from these deep gravel soils. They're very lush, they're very rich wines, they're very soft wines. They have a lot of complexity to them. This is a great vineyard. It's farmed by Pete Richmond, who's a terrific farmer, Silverado Farming, organic farmer. He does a great job. He really has a great crew as well. The vineyard has two sections to it that we got at the time. And one of the sections is an old vine section that is non-irrigated. So no irrigation on it. And then there's a newer section that's planted to more sexy clones that is irrigated. And both sections have their wonderful aspects about them. The section that's non-irrigated is unusual in that when we get the wine immediately out of vat, when we try it at first, it tastes awful. I mean, just terrible. It's thin and green and boring. And I've never seen a wine like this that just builds and builds and builds and builds and produces wonderful wines after it ages for a while in barrel. And by the second year, it's one of the best Cabernet Francs in our stable. So it's a vineyard we've been working with. We still work with this vineyard, Crocker Star Cabernet Franc. We still work with the same 2 blocks up until last year that we've always worked with. So the Merlot portion in this would have come directly from Blackbird's estate, Merlot. That would be half of it, and the other half would be from Stagecoach Vineyard. So 2 very different Merlots. This block 14A at Stagecoach is at about 1,200 feet in altitude. It's in the eastern hills, so the Vaca range. It's all that red basaltic soil, these huge chunks of rock that are bright orange or red from rust, huge iron content in them. When you knock them together, they're so dense, they make this incredible metallic sound as they go together. And it really makes Merlots that are incredibly structured. They're very rich. They are more towards the floral spectrum, more towards the black olive spectrum than they are strictly fruit driven. And that's kind of one of the reasons we like them. Most of what my experience with Blackbird has been is trying to move the vineyards from being northern vineyards to being more southern, cooler vineyards. And over the time that I've been working with Blackbird, we've gone further and further south and further into the mountains to find cooler and cooler sites. So the Blackbird Estate Vineyard, as I said, was planted in 1997. It's again a good example of these gravel soils. The estate vineyard has a real unusual layer of gravel. It's a gravel layer below that's just above the Napa River. And then on top of that is a clay layer. So it's quite thick clay. And whenever you have clay in wine, you have structure. You have tannins, you have richness, you have wines that are long-lived. When you have sand, you have wines that are often short-lived wines. They drink young. They're pleasurable as young wines, but often do not age as well as wines from very intense clay soils. There are exceptions to that, but for the most part, that's remains true. The last portion of this is the Cabernet Sauvignon portion, that little 8%. And this comes from an interesting vineyard that I was working with for my own wines, for pot wine. And it's a vineyard that's behind the restaurant Bricks. So just north of Yountville. It's in the Oakville appellation. It's right in the heart of Oakville, in that marvelous area that we can't mention the name of because it's a registered trademark, which is a bit ridiculous. But so this is right behind the Bricks restaurant, and it was kind of a famous canoodling point where you would go out in the vineyard and there would be people making out in there after having a boozy lunch. So I think there was some happiness that the vines derived from that. And it made wonderful Cabernet Sauvignon. I actually bottled a Cabernet Sauvignon called Neruda that was we made a couple of years in a row that was made from this vineyard. So clearly the romantic boozy lunches that led to romantic trysts in the vineyard were a positive thing for these Cabernet Sauvignon vines. Older vineyards, we moved away from it as it started getting diseased. It's owned by the people that own Brick's restaurant, the Kelleher family. So let's taste this wine. I mean, oh, it's even more attractive. We're really getting into the black truffle now. Yeah, very rich mouthfeel. Beauty. You're really getting the flavor of that Merlot. I mean, you get that black truffle character. You get the anise or the black licorice character, and then you get that Cabernet Franc with the tobacco and the cedar, and beautifully, it's held together beautifully. This wine, it's wonderful. I find it hard to leave. Excuse me, I just have to do that so I can get through this thing. Let's move on to the next one. Wow, that's so good, though. Do we have to move on? Okay. Next is Contrarian. There she is. So Contrarian came about because we had all of these wonderful Cabernet Sauvignon vineyards. And as you know, Napa Valley is really all about Cabernet Sauvignon. And nothing could be more contrarian to the idea of Blackbird's right bank vineyards than putting some Cabernet Sauvignon in there. So we created Contrarian to be the carrier of that Cabernet Sauvignon. And, you know, it's king in Napa Valley, Cabernet Sauvignon. And it's also a wonderful wine. Cabernet Sauvignon makes wines that are long-lived like no other wines. I mean, I think of all of the 19th century wines that I've had, and most of them that have been long-lived have been either Cabernets or Rieslings. So Cabernet can go the distance. It has the structure to go the distance. It has the flavor and the intensity to go the distance. From a wonderful site, it can do well. It's also very forgiving. It can be planted in a lot of different areas, and that makes it very forgiving. So you can make great Cabernet Sauvignon from many sites in Napa Valley, but there are few sites that can make really exceptional Cabernet Sauvignon. But overall, it can be very great. So this is 2009 Contrarian. Contrary to 2008, we had very little frost. It was almost an ideal growing season. I think there were 5 days where we had any frost risk in the early part of the growing season. During the whole vintage, in certain areas, there were only 4 days that were over 100 degrees. So it's a very cool vintage. And it starts a series of very different and very cool vintages for us, 9, 10, and 11 being very unusual, very cool, and very qualitative vintages for Napa Valley. Late spring rains saved the vineyards, really, because we only had 70% of normal rainfall in 2009, and we're really focusing on these drought vintages. But because we had spring rains, the soil profiles were full of water when the vines started to bud out. So we had the grapes, they have no idea, they're sleeping all winter long. They wake up, they think, oh my gosh, look at all this water, we can grow like crazy, it's been a great winter. They didn't suffer like we did by having only 70% of the rain. It was all there in the water, in the profiles, and they went for it. They really grew very quickly. in the early season. We had a couple big rains in harvest that year, but they didn't seem to have much effect on the grapes. In fact, we up at Stagecoach Vineyard that year, we had a huge rain in one day, but it didn't have much of an effect on the quality. It was early enough on that it didn't affect the quality of the fruit. So, I mean, this is very, very classic Cabernet, very forest hummus, black olive, black currants, blackberry, black licorice again, that truffle character. I think we're getting that really from the Merlot component of this, which is not small. This wine it's 41% Cabernet Franc, 25% Cabernet Sauvignon, and 24% Merlot. So it's a high percentage of Cabernet Sauvignon, but it's not the dominant. Grape in this wine. And the Cabernet Sauvignon comes from a vineyard that some of you may know from Hall Vineyards, a vineyard called Rainin. And Rainin was a vineyard we worked with at Blackbird for a few years. It's sort of middle Diamond Mountain, lower to middle Diamond Mountain area, and a vineyard that was very intense. The wines were very intensely structured as young wines, and were almost unforgiving. They would dry out your mouth like crazy, but would age very nicely. The Cabernet Franc component of this wine is from two different vineyards: Crocker Star, which we already talked about, that St. Helena vineyard, gravel, fabulous gravel vineyard, and then a vineyard again up in the Stagecoach area, a vineyard called M3, which some of you may know my wine, Her Majesty's Secret Service, under the Pott label. And that vineyard is right across the alley from this Cabernet Franc vineyard. It's an older vine vineyard, one of the earliest ones planted at Stagecoach. Wonderful Cabernet Franc, selection 214, and produces fabulous wines. The Merlot comes from the block we talked about at Stagecoach, 14A, and then a vineyard called Young Inglewood Vineyard. And I have to give a shout out to Young Inglewood. They make some wonderful wines. I especially love their Aligoté. I think it's a family-owned winery, Young Inglewood, at the end of Inglewood Lane in St. Helena, and a nice gravel vineyard next to Senegal. Wonderful family, Jim and Jackie Young, and their son makes the wines. Scott Young's a very talented winemaker. Anyway, I seem to have a friend that has arrived in my glass, so I will have to re-pour. I have a huge bunch of fruit flies hanging around my house, mainly because I've got a barrel of vinegar that they all seem to love. I love it too, it's really good, but they all love this barrel of vinegar. Oh, I love that nose. It's really, you really feel like you're taking a walk in the forest, or as we all learned, forest bathing, as they say in Japan. We are forest bathing in this 2009 Contrarian. Again, the wine is spot on, showing no signs of going anywhere. It's in beautiful shape, good length. It's just starting to soften out nicely. It has a lot of kind of roast meat characters, which are really nice. It's sort of a roast beef intensity to the finish that really lingers on. They're so original, these wines. I mean, it's easy for me to say because I make them, but they're really, really original wines. And I enjoy making them for that. So let's talk a little bit about the winemaking. I think next time we meet in a week from today, we will meet down at the winery because for some ridiculous reason we've been made essential personnel. I can see why now, because during these times you need to drink more wine. And it is very, very, very important for us to be working still. Okay, so I'm going to the illustration, 2010 illustration. I don't even know if it comes out correctly that way, but anyway, we're 2010 illustration. Oh, I can see people are asking questions. Ask questions because that will be very helpful. So winemaking, in our new winery, we have just about everything you need to make wine. And I don't know if all of you know, but we not only make the Blackbird wines, but I also make a lot of my client wines that don't have their own wineries there. And then I make my own wines at the facility. We have just in the last 2 years built this amazing facility. Everything is new in it. It is a very nondescript warehouse building from the outside, but on the inside, it is a state-of-the-art facility, fabulous facility. Grapes come in. They are sorted on an incline sorter as grapes. They are destemmed. They are then sent to a shaker table and further sorted, mainly to get out the raisins, to get out the shot berries. They go to an optical sorter that sorts them for size and for roundness and for color. And then they're further hand sorted before they get deposited gently into a tank. Now, all of the tanks that we work with for the Blackbird wines are all from a marvelous tank maker from a little town outside of Saint-Emilion called Castillon-la-Bataille. And it is called Castillon-la-Bataille for one reason. It was where one of the important and last battles of the 100 Years' War happened in 1453. Somebody should fact check me on that one, but I think I'm pretty close. Anyway, the General Talbots, who has a famous chateau in Bordeaux, was killed at this battle. And the town became Castillon-la-Bataille, and there's some good wines. The Côte de Castillon is there. There's some interesting wines in there. But anyway, this famous tank maker is there, and he made all of these wonderful stainless steel tanks for us. And they all have their own separate pump over device on them. So we can automatically set up pump overs so they work over a 24-hour period, but also so that each lot of wine has its own individual course that it goes through. We don't have to just sort of systematically work a tank. We can take each tank and work it completely differently from the other tanks. So it makes it ideal to sort of fine-tune the grapes and fine-tune the wines as they're going to fermentation to produce wonderful wines. So I'm giving you too much information. So fermentation, cold soak, fermentation, maceration. The wines go directly to barrel. We work with several different coopers, all coopers from France. Jean-Louis Bossuet, who's an old friend. I was the first guy to buy his barrels and select wood for his barrels. Jean-Luc Sylvain, Tannery Sylvain, we work with Terranceau, we work with Atelier Centre-France, Nedalier, and also Tannery Baron, who we work with all of those coopers. They've been committed to making Blackbird wines fabulous. Okay, So 2010, we're here, illustration. And this is an unusual illustration in that it's only 48% Merlot, 30% Cabernet Franc, and 22% Cabernet Sauvignon. So 2010 is good, huge winter rainfall. Had no problem with that. Very late bud break. It was a cool winter. Things didn't start going until very late. Took a while. We had very little hot days. There was a little heat spike of kind of 2 days in August, really before any of the red grapes had gone through veraison. For us, at least, anyway. And then there was this fantastic, cool kind of Indian summer. A lot of people stripped the leaves because it was a very cold year, and they were scared that they were not going to get enough heat on the grapes to ripen them properly. So you had a lot of people that stripped leaves in the fruit zone and exposed the fruit, and then you had these very intense heat spikes that came through late on. Allowed the grapes to ripen, but also caused a lot of sunburn on that exposed fruit. One of the things I was pretty proud that we didn't do was do any leafing, any extra leafing in the vintage. So we didn't have any raisoning. And it's one of the vintages that really sticks out for me in terms of quality of the wines that we made in that vintage. As opposed to other wines. I taste a lot of raisiny wines in 2010 from Napa Valley. And I'm really quite proud of the wines that we made, that they really took advantage of this cool weather and created really lovely, very straightforward, wonderful, very fruity, lovely wines. This is just gorgeous. I mean, it's very integrated. You know, the nose is just this incredible black cherry, a very strong black cherry. You get that that little puff of violet and the iris character as well. There's that black truffle again, where we're seeing that black truffle in the Merlots as they age wonderfully. They get more and more of that character. It's a really powerful, powerful nose. Oh, that's fabulous. Tobacco, and I might have to have just a sip of that without spitting it out. But wonderful tobacco character. Really get that black truffle in the mouth. It's kind of a smoked duck meat character you get. All the truffle, I love somebody said. All the truffle, yes, all the truffle and more. Cheers, my friends. Oh, that's delicious. Wow, the finish on that is just like velvet, as they say in France, le petit Jésus en culotte de velours, little baby Jesus in velvet underpants. That is yummy. So illustration is, there were some unusual sources in this that we actually don't source from anymore. This was a vineyard, Tambor Vineyards, from off of Mount Veeder, that we sourced for a couple of years. It was a south-facing hillside vineyard up on Mount Veeder, and I think everybody who's probably watching this knows how much I love Mount Veeder. It's where my own vineyard is, Châteauneuf-du-Pape. And I love the intensity of Mount Veeder. It's just marvelous stuff. Great things. I have a question here. What are your everyday wine choices? From Laura W. That's a good question. I think my everyday wine choices are, I mean, I love wine. I love every wine, and I have a collection of about 3,000 bottles in a cellar, and I'm a drinker. I love to drink wines, and so that rotates quite quickly. I love wines from all over the world. I think there's almost in every region there's somebody making something great. I drink a lot of wines from Napa because I get a lot of wines for free from Napa, and I have a lot of friends that are interested in trading wines, so I do a lot of that. I drink a fair amount of French wines too. I went to school in Burgundy, so I really like the wines of Burgundy, but they're getting to be very expensive. So I am often looking for other things. So for the last sort of 5 years, I've been looking a lot at natural wines and enjoying some of those, not a lot of those. I'm going to make a natural wine of my own. So in response to all of the natural wines that I've tried. Okay, and then here's another question. Hey, Aaron, what is more impactful for Cabernet Franc in Napa Valley, soil or location? That's a great question, and it's from a lovely guy, George Stakos, who works for Ramey, David Ramey, who's been a big influence on my wine world, as on everybody's, I think, in Napa Valley or in Sonoma as well. But I think both are important. Soil is the most important, but certainly location makes a difference. I think if you can find the right soil in Napa Valley, that's any of the locations in Napa Valley are going to work for you. But Cabernet Franc definitely needs to be well drained. It can't have wet feet. It needs to be very well drained. We find it works really well in the ash soils, the tuft, volcanic tuft soils, those white soils, especially when they have a little bit of iron content in them. I mean, that's Seven Stones has a small section of Cabernet Franc that's wonderful from those tuff soils. I also remember from my days as a Newton winemaker, there was a couple of really great sites up there that had volcanic tuft soils. Again, those deep gravel soils in the benchland, those are terrific. Really love those. You can have another sip of this. It's so good. And then, I mean, hillsides. We all love the hillsides. So I hate to pour this out, but we have to move on at some point. Oh, time in barrel. Joel asks, how much time do the wines spend in barrel? The wines go down to barrel hot, I like to say, but as they leave tank, they go directly to barrel. That's pre-malolactic fermentation. So they finish their primary fermentation. They finish their time in maceration. They have yet to go through malo. We try to slow down the malo process in barrel as much as we possibly can to make that last as long as we possibly can. So we can take advantage of the lees, among other things. But so the wines spend about 18 months in barrel, 18 to 20 months, depending on the vintage. And now we're on to a rise. And this is the rise, often referred to as the second wine of Blackbird Vineyards after the principal wines. People always say, oh, I don't like to call it a second wine, but I kind of do like to call it a second wine. It also is a real expression of how I feel about the first wines, because this is generally made up after we make it's definitely made up after we make the principal wines. So we go through, we taste for the principal wines, and then we go through and taste what remains to make a rise. And a rise is meant to be more fruit friendly, more forward, more early term drinking, but I think we'll be surprised here. This is 2011, and as some of you may know, 2011 is a very challenging vintage. I found it so much fun. I had more fun making wines in 2011 than in any other vintage. I mean, mainly because it was it was weather that I was really familiar with, having worked harvests in France for so many years. It was weather I was really familiar with, and I don't think any of the winemakers that had just worked in the U.S. had experienced anything like that. I think it was a very unusual vintage. I mean, we had a very wet winter and very wet spring, 30% more rain than normal. So everything was ready to come out, but it was a very cold spring as well. We had a lot of rainfall, rainfall into mid-June. Most of the people abandoned their high heels at the Napa Valley wine auction in favor of wellies. So there were a lot of people wearing cellar boots at that event. Latest harvest ever for sparkling wine that anybody can remember. Very cool summer, October rains. We had three different rain events that brought considerable rain, and then sort of a deep fog set into the valley floor, and it really messed with the grapes on the valley floor. We had a lot of issues with botrytis, powdery mildew in that vintage. So there was a lot of sorting that needed to be done, and a lot of technique from the old country. And this is something we rarely ever see. Okay, let me look at these questions before. We are fans of wines Sam Kaplan makes. Yeah, I like Sam Kaplan too. I like his wines. Do you know his wines, and what do you think? Yes, Memento Mori, yes, like it. Arkenstone, yes, like it. I do. I like his whites too. He's a nice guy as well. Ralph, we love your wines. How would you describe your style, and who else in Napa is making wine that you resonate with? Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you, by the way, for loving my wines. But it's really, I think we get a lot of credit, a lot more than we deserve. What really makes the difference in wine is the vineyard. And what really makes the difference is how we as vineyard people and wine people interpret the vineyard and how we take care of the vineyard. And I think that's the most important thing. I can't overstate how important it is to have organic vineyards, and how that makes such a huge difference in making wines. That makes my job easier. And the more you try to do to a wine, the less it's going to be good. The more you add to it, we have a philosophy of indigenous yeast, of doing, indigenous bacteria, doing as little as we possibly can, low sulfur dioxide. It's just, our ingredients lists are nothing but grapes, and that's it. And I think that's a very important point. So anything we do as winemakers to cloud the issue makes for bad wine. And so I think my style is that I read the book. I am very close to the vineyard. I love working in the vineyards. I love studying the vineyards. And I try as best I can to use what I learn in the vineyards to make wines that express the most of the vineyard. And then people that resonate with me, winemakers, I like Helen Keplinger's wines. I love John Kongsgaard's wines. I'm very good friends with Philippe Melka. I love his wines. Jean Hofflinger, I love his wines as well. There's lots of wonderful people making wines out there, and really talented people. There's some real unsung talented people. I mean, I'm a big fan of Jérôme Chéry's wines, and he's very, very unknown guy, but makes wonderful wines as well. How long did it take you to find your vineyard? How long did it take me to find my vineyard? Kind of all my life. I would say. I mean, I bought my property in 2004 and didn't really plant it until 2010. But knew what I was looking for before then. But it didn't take long for me to find what I was looking for. I like this person, owner. How would you describe Blackbird wine versus your pot wines? Aside from the first vintage, is there a particular year of Blackbird that you like? Yeah, I think for Blackbird, I think the wines are getting better and better. And I think the most recent vintages are really some of the best we've ever done. I think we're, with the new owners, John and Julia Hinshaw, they've really decided to focus on the wine more than anything else. And I'm really proud to work with them. They're very smart people. They get what Blackbird is all about. They're interested in making wines that are going to be legendary. And I think they're really focusing on the wine again. More than at any other time that I've worked with Blackbird. And so we're really getting back into it at the highest levels. And I'm very excited about the recent wines. Probably 2010 was a great vintage for Blackbird, but I think that you'll see the 18s and 19s are phenomenal. They're really phenomenal. And Blackbird versus Pot, they're very different wines. They come from different vineyards. They're made in very different ways. The pot wines are much smaller in scale and fermented in oak, open tops and clay for the most part, and they're all hand worked. So very, very different process, but and very different vineyards. Other Cab wines you like, other Cab Franc wines you like. There's quite a few. One of my favorite, Joel, this is Joel's question, my favorite Cab Franc wine, I think in Napa is probably the Maya from Dalla Valle. I think they make spectacular wines. And I think that Andy Erickson has been doing a wonderful job with them for years. And now Maya Dalla Valle herself has started making a lot of the wines there and is continuing that wonderful tradition. And she has a great background making wines in France as well, working with some pretty high-level people over there. Curious asking, and which of these do you think has the most life left in it? Contrarian seems to have decade plus left. Impressive. Yes, Palmer. I love your name, actually. Chateau Palmer. Contrarian. What's what I like now today. I mean, I really love this illustration. I think it's offering what you want today. I think Paramour as well. It's offering what you want today, but that Contrarian's got ages to go from it. 2009 is a very structured vintage. The wines are incredibly structured. I hired my assistant in 2009 who, and that was his first year working on the Blackbird wines. And Eric Hagyard is his name. And I always blamed him for the hard tannins in the wines because he's incredibly muscular. He's like this very muscular Viking, and I blamed him that he punched down too hard in 2009. But it was the wines were like that in 2009. They were incredibly structured wines. Can you speak to tannin quality, especially the supple, mature tannin in your wines? I mean, I have to. That's again George Stakos. I have to say that the tannin, all of my experiences with tannin really come from one person, and that was working with Michel Roland. And I worked with Michel when I was very young, when I just started out in the wine industry as an assistant winemaker. And Michel got me my job in France at this place, Trollon-Mando. And I ate up everything that he had to say. And I really think he's a very talented crafter of wines and taster of wines. And he can get tannins like no one else I have ever known. And he showed me how to do that in many ways. And a lot of it has to do with maceration process. A lot of it has to do with selecting the grapes at the right time. And there's a lot more to it. I could go on. This could be a 5-hour version of this, talking just about Michel Rolland and his techniques for softening tannins. But I think, again, you get great tannin from out of a vineyard, and our job is to extract that tannin and then to bring it together in a wine. So structurally, it's impressive in the wine, but also supple and then age-worthy as well. So it's a lot of complex ideas. I always tell people that it's like being a DJ, where you're putting on records in order to make people dance at different times in different ways during the night. So you put on your early records to get people out on the dance floor, and then you put on your slow jams to get people dancing together, and so on. And you're kind of controlling the night. It's the same thing in wine. You're doing early pump overs and punch downs to get the tannins out, and then you're starting to get those tannins to couple together, to become structured, to become supple, to become part of the wine, to integrate with the wine. And that's really what winemaking is all about. And I learned that from Michel and also from his wife Dany Rolland. And those early lessons allowed me to ask more questions of other people about tannin and about tannin quality. And it's also, I have to say, I was very fortunate enough to taste great wine. And I think that's getting harder and harder for people. And I really feel for young people that are coming into the wine industry that have never tasted these great wines because they're prohibitively expensive. And I have been able to taste, the 47 Cheval Blancs, the 59 Lataches, and so on. And I've had these great wines and have a reference point where I can work with my wines and try to emulate some of these characteristics of the greater wines. And I think that's, I think at some stage we're going to have to set up like a fund for people to be able to go through and taste these wines, because if you go to a natural wine seminar, and some of these people have never made wine before and they're making wine for the first time, and then they've never tasted great wine, and you taste their wines and they're totally flawed, and you think, what have you done? What have you done? But I think we need to have a fund. Somebody needs to put a fund together so young people can taste the classics. Enjoying the 2009 illustration right now. Lovely. We know John and Julia well. Yeah. Okay. And love the focus on making the wine the best it can be. Can you comment on the Arriviste? We love the rosé. Yeah. So the Arriviste is the Blackbird rosé, and it came out of a fun conversation. The founder of Blackbird, Michael Polensky, he would not do anything unless it had some sort of basis in the lore of Blackbird Vineyards. And so he was, when we started making rosé, and it was rosé from Saignée, where we bleed the tanks, in order to concentrate the red wines. He kept asking me if there's any sort of history of making rosés in the right bank specifically. And I told him the story that we always made rosé that we would give to the vineyard workers. And in France, at Trollomando, we hired mainly gypsy vineyard people. And I mean, these were the real hardcore gypsies that would come with some in caravans, with horse-drawn caravans, but most of them in trailers that were drawn by a late model Mercedes with rings all over their fingers, and they would come to, at the end of harvest, they'd come to the cellar, line up, and we would give them their liter of wine per person per day. And everybody, I mean, if they had a baby that they would bring along, they would bring the liter container for that baby, and you would pour that baby a liter if they had done any work at all. And they would drink it and usually stay up quite late, and there were guitars and fires and all sorts of things going on. So it was, that was the precedent. Oh, hey, Iz. And that was the wine precedent that created the Arriviste. And really, it's we're lucky that we work with a lot of Cab Franc and Merlot, because Cab Franc and Merlot make wonderful rosé, and that's a lot of that goes into the Arriviste. Arise, yeah, a little more forward fruit there. I mean, you see the vintage. There's that wonderful forest floor aroma again, and beautiful black currant fruit there. Real licorice character, that real black licorice, and then a bit of fennel, anise. It's a bit minty, you know. Oftentimes in a vintage that's not super ripe, you get a little mint in Merlot, which is kind of uplifting, I think. Oh, that is youthful, beautiful acidity there, and bright, and that has a lot of time left. This brings in a couple of vineyards that we haven't talked about. One is a lot of this Merlot fruit comes from the estate vineyard, which we have talked about. Again, Cabernet Franc from M3 at Stagecoach, Cabernet Franc from Crocker Star that we talked about. Hey, Wiz. And then two vineyards that we haven't talked about: Ballard Vineyard, Cabernet Sauvignon, which is Ballard's on the very top of Spring Mountain, and it's a vineyard that's owned by friends of mine. I helped them develop the vineyard in 2001, and originally the idea was to develop it for Beringer, whom I was working with at the time. And then we started buying the fruit, and I think 11 was the first vintage for Blackbird. I started buying the fruit in 2008. Maybe we were earlier than that. I can't really recall when the first vintage was, but we started working with the fruit in 2007, excuse me, and 2008, and we make a wine to this day from that vineyard that's called Cali Hole Nanook, which is what the Wapo natives called Ritchie Creek, coming off of Spring Mountain, which really means naked, friendly woods people. So it's a vineyard that's right at the top of Spring Mountain, and 2,262 feet. It's above Philip Tawney's vineyard. It's owned by the two of the most delightful people that you've ever met. He is Carol Ballard. He's a filmmaker, Christina Ballard, his wife, is Swiss, still does all the tractor work on the property. And then the last Cabernet Franc on this in this wine is from Hudson Vineyard, and it's an iconic vineyard in Carneros, kind of right on the border of where Cabernet Franc and Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot, all of which we have planted in that vineyard for Blackbird, ripen. And so it's a very cold climate vineyard. It's owned by Lee Hudson. Hudson Vineyards has been there for quite a while. Lee, of course, planted the vineyard after working a few years at Domaine Dujac in Burgundy, and really started out growing Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, and then branched out into Bordeaux varietals and also Rhone varietals. So if you ever get the chance to try the Kongsgaard Syrah from out of that vineyard, it's absolutely spectacular. But I started working with Lee's fruit in 1990 with Newton Vineyard, mainly working with the Chardonnays for the first version of the Newton Unfiltered Chardonnay, which coincidentally was from the 1990 vintage. So anyway, I will conclude there with Arise. I hope you've enjoyed our conversation. If there are any more questions, let me know. Please join us again next week. I'll be coming to you live from the winery. So I want to show you all the winery and what we've done there. And I wish you well, wealth and happiness and health. I hope you are all good. And thanks for joining me. Cheers.